Hi everyone, thank you so much for joining me for episode 10 of Friday Book Bites. And this week I am very excited to be joined by fellow Penguin author and debut crime writer, Kyle Perry. Hi Kyle, thank you so much for joining us today.
Hi Sandy, it's good to be here.
And we're going to talk today about your book, The Bluffs, which I finished yesterday. And we were just talking off camera then about how I didn't pick the twist, which is the sign of some very, very good writing. And we're going to talk about the dark side of fiction. Before we do that, though, I'm just going to pop up the giveaway for today's session so that I don't forget to do it later. So if anyone makes a comment or asks a question, either during today when we are live or up until midnight Saturday night, if you are watching this back later, you will go in the running to win a copy of Kyle's book, The Bluffs. And as I said, I finished it yesterday, and I think this is something that you definitely want to win. So welcome, Kyle. Let's get started with the big picture question, I guess. Domestic noir and crime are going absolute gangbusters here in Australia right now. And I wanted to ask you what you think our fascination as readers is with this darker side of humanity.
I think that at the end of the day, especially in Australia, we are very sheltered. And I don't say that mockingly. It's just the reality that compared to the rest of the world, Australians are very lucky. And I work in mental health. I work on the front lines of drug and alcohol addiction. And I can tell you there's stuff that goes on behind the scenes that are really dark and terrible. But even that really is pretty sheltered compared to what a lot of the world goes through. When you read a book, there's something that goes on inside of your brain where your body can sometimes respond as though it's happening to you, as though you're experiencing the events of the story. And so I think crime, what it does is, I think at some level, especially in Australia, we recognize that there's not that much risk and danger in our lives. And so when we read books with risk and danger and high stakes, our bodies really respond to that. They really like that thrill because we don't really encounter that. And so from a psychological point of view, I think that's part of why crime is so popular, especially now, is because we crave risk, we crave danger at a certain level, and we just don't really get it in our life.
So even people like me, and it's no secret to any of my followers that I'm a massive scaredy cat. I'm very open about that. So even people like me, you say we crave that risk, and maybe that's the safe way to do it through a book, particularly for people like me who won't go and do it in real life.
Because your body is actually hardwired to survive. And you've got all these different responses that get triggered in your body. And anxiety itself, I mean, I don't want to get into a big discussion about mental health, but anxiety in some ways is just that response, hijacked. But even people who are like, scaredy cats or who don't like, terrifying situations, your body still has a part of it that wants to exercise its adrenaline. It wants to exercise its problem-solving skills. And so that's what escapism does so well, is it helps our body do that in a safe environment. So, yeah, absolutely. There's something inside of you that's a wild woman longing to return to the bush, and this book scratches that itch.
I think my 14-year-old daughter would disagree with you entirely on that. She thinks I am the most boring person in the world.
You can tell her science says otherwise.
Excellent. I'll let her know that next time she rolls her eyes at me. Now, I was watching you talk on the Better Reading chat last week, I think it was, and you mentioned that when you first wrote your first draft of The Bluffs, it actually headed into the horror territory. And sorry, I'm just going to interrupt myself here. Leanne asked, where is Margot? There she is right there, Leanne. She's popped in to say hello.
Just for you, Leanne.
As if on cue.
She knows when she's been talking. Sorry. All right.
No, that's okay. So you said that the first draft was heading more into the horror territory than crime. What was it that made you change your mind? And how do you know how dark to go when you're writing dark fiction?
That's a really good question about how dark to go. And I'll answer that one first because I knew that I wanted this book to be really cathartic, which meant it had to end on a happy note, or happy as possible. And so to me, it didn't matter how dark I went, as long as there was a little bit of light at the end of the story.
Okay.
In terms of how it changed from horror to crime, I don't plan when I write. I just shoot from the hip. And so I started writing this story, and it just evolved into a bit more of a horror kind of Wolf Creek story. And it wasn't until I got some feedback from my agent's intern, actually, her name's Jamie Collins. I thank her in the acknowledgements. And she identified there were some chapters I could remove, which would increase the suspense. And as soon as I removed those chapters, I had a whole different story. And it was really strange to see. And all those chapters were from one character's point of view, basically. And as soon as I removed that character point of view, it changed in a whole different direction. Which I think is normal. We love to put books into genre categories, but I mean, in reality, they're super malleable, and there's lots of crossing lines. Life is complicated. Life isn't black and white, and it's the same with fiction.
Cassie's asked us a follow-up question to this. Hi, Cassie. Thank you for joining us today. What's the difference between horror and crime? Is it the volume of blood and the gore, or is it the body count?
That's a good question. I mean, I don't know the actual answer to that, but I'm guessing it would be more the be hinged more on the story. I'd say if the story is based more about solving a crime versus, you know, a bit of slash and thrills. And also, I guess if you add in a really heavy supernatural slant, it's more likely to be horror. But I don't know. What do you think, Sandy?
You know, I think you're right. I think that horror is there where primarily it is the slash and the thrills, and that's what the reader is going there for. And, you know, having a resolution at the end isn't necessarily important, whereas crime, as readers, we want to know if this crime is going to get solved, and so we're much more focused on that than maybe how people have died or how many people have died. It's that solving that mystery, I guess.
Yeah, and I think horror in a way is similar to heavy metal music. And if you talk to fans of heavy metal, they'll say they don't listen to it for the lyrics because the voice itself is almost an instrument. And I think it might be a bit the same with horror, whereas you're not really listening to it for the voice and the story. You're more listening to it just for the emotions it gives you. I don't know. That'll be my other take.
No, I think that sounds perfectly reasonable. Danny has got a question for us, and there's quite a few questions coming through, so we'll just go through them as they come through. With so many plot twists in crime fiction, and there are definitely some twists in here, as I said, I thought I had it nailed, and then I was totally wrong in the end. How do you plan the writing so that you foreshadow these things without giving away the twists?
That's a really good question. Most of it comes down to instinct. And so if you want to write a really good book, it has to be organic, in my opinion. And so as you're writing the book, you're discovering as you go along. And so sometimes something will come up in the story and you'll think that feels like foreshadowing. That feels like something's going to come from that. And so it's just natural that happens later. In another direction, once you've written the story, it's pretty normal to go back through and just make sure it's realistic. Sorry, she's biting the computer.
Okay.
It's pretty normal to go back through and just make sure that is well signposted. But you'll find a lot of readers. I've noticed reading the reviews, which have mostly been great, is some people think that stuff has been signposted too much, and some people think stuff hasn't been signposted enough. So. You know, it just really depends on you as a reader and you as a writer.
Yeah, I think as writers, we can't always tell that either because we're so close to the story and we know in our heads exactly what's going on with each of our characters. Whether we've then translated that onto the page is something we can't always see, and that's where a really good editor or a really good beta reader comes in handy to help us. And I don't know what those other reviewers are talking about because we were discussing again just before we went live that I didn't pick the twist yet, even though I didn't pick it, when you look back, the signs were there. It wasn't out of left field. It wasn't, you know, completely unbelievable. It made perfect sense in the end. So I think you did a brilliant job of foreshadowing without giving it away. So
good. Well, thank you for that feedback. I appreciate it.
And I pride myself on picking twists, you know, as a storyteller myself. And I usually do. My daughter gets really mad when we're watching movies because I go, oh, well, this is going to happen and this is going to happen. And she's like, oh, Mom, why are you ruining it for me? So yeah, well done, because I didn't pick it. Cheryl's got a question here. Last week when I was speaking with Danny from Words and Nerds podcast, we were talking about planning and pantsing, and it was a term new to Cheryl. Are you a planner or a pantser?
Yeah, absolutely a pantser. I fly by the seat of my pants. From the moment I sit down, I just shoot from the hip. And I'm pretty lucky in that, uniquely for a writer, I have a pretty short attention span. And so if I get bored with a plot point, I just switch it up and then I deal with the carnage later. So however, I mean, you have to write for a while before you develop the right instincts, I think. There's a lot of merit to be said for planning, and I reckon I would have saved a lot of time. Like, I rewrote this manuscript. I reckon about 60 to 70% of it was, closer to 60. 60% would have been rewritten after I made those changes I spoke about before, which moved it from horror to crime. And if I'd been able to plan it, might have been able to avoid all that. But anyway, I fly by the seat of your pants. Only way to do it. Only way to do life.
I'm a pantser all the way with my writing as well. And like you, I've had to rewrite my novels quite extensively because of that. So I think that's perfectly natural. Danny's got a follow-up question.
Can I just, are you ever tempted to change and be a planner? Does that ever cross your mind to think, oh, maybe I should stop?
Oh, look, when I'm in the thick of editing and the deadline's looming and I've got no idea what I'm doing, I wish I was a plotter because it would be easier. But I think I'm just not wired that way. I'm a very disorganized person in life anyway. If I panned my camera around, you would see the disorganization that surrounds me. This is the pretty side of things. I think you've got to go with your natural instincts as a writer, whether that be plotting or pantsing or a hybrid of both. And I think if you try to force yourself to be the other version, whatever that is, then I don't think your stories are going to ring true. That's my take on it.
Yeah, and so, like you said, everyone's a hybrid of two. In my opinion, it's like it's a spectrum, you know, and so you fall somewhere along the spectrum, but you're never one or the other. You're somewhere along the middle.
Yeah. Danny's question following up this is, given that you are a pantser, how do you keep those twists in line?
As soon as a character rocks up on the page, I know everything about them. That's something that I think is a strength of mine as a writer, and that comes primarily from my background, my training in counseling, is that as soon as a character shows up, I know exactly what makes them tick and what they're going to do. So even though the plot itself is kind of coming to me as I write, the twists, I mean, at the end of the day, unless they're, you know, an act of God, most twists are character driven. So to me, they're not necessarily coming out of nowhere, because as soon as I met that character, I knew, oh yeah, this is what's going to happen. This is what they're going to do. And this is why. And so even though I don't know when the twist is coming in the story, or I don't necessarily know what the twist is, I do know what that character is capable of. And I know enough about writing to try and convince everyone else who's reading that it's not that character, that it's something else. Does that answer? I think that answers the question.
Absolutely right on that. It was something that I had to learn when I first started writing, which is about 20 years ago now. And that is that everything happens for a reason. And those reasons have to be because they're being driven by the characters. That can't just be, you know, some random left of field act that they do. It has to make sense in their narrative. I think that's absolutely right.
Yeah.
All right. Cheryl is talking about the foreshadowing in my novel Banksia Bay. Now, mine is not crime at all. You can tell from the covers that they're not. crime, but even in less dark fiction like women's fiction, we have these secrets that need to come out, and foreshadowing is a really important part of that. And as I said before, I think that comes in with our editors or other readers that help us make sure we get that right, because it's not easy and we don't always get it right the first time.
No.
Michelle Parsons has got a question for you. Michelle, if you haven't met her yet, Kyle, she's also known as the author stalker. She likes to stalk authors, and she has a blog post that she does with that. She may hit you up later on for an interview. She wants to know if you've always wanted to be a writer.
Always. Always. Ever since primary school, at least. I remember, to put it into a concrete moment, was in grade 6 when I sent an email to Tamara Pierce, who's a fantasy writer, and I said, I want to be a writer like you. And she responded and said, you've got what it takes. You know, just based off your email, you know, even though you're quite young, I can tell you've got what it takes. So if I look back, I know that was a moment when I knew for sure. But before that, I always wanted to be a writer. I think that's the goal, and every decision I've made in my life has been towards that goal. Even my degree and my training and qualification as a counsellor was because I wanted to do that as a person, and I wanted to give back, and I wanted to learn how to help my friends and help society. But underneath all of it, I recognized that this will help me be a better writer. So, you know, I made a lot of decisions over my life about, you know, I've traveled a lot. I've spent a lot of money on experiences, not because I've been frivolous. You know, it'd be quite nice to have a house deposit, but I recognize that for me to be the best writer I can be, I had to invest in that. And so, yes, I've always wanted to be a writer. And what part of being published surprised you the most? How much of a people-based industry it is, which makes sense now, but at the time you kind of assume book people are a little bit either more business focused or a little bit more aloof, but really they're very warm, and it's all about people. And even the fact that I haven't been able to tour on the mainland and go to mainland bookshops does affect my sales, because booksellers, so the people who own bookshops, they want to know who you are before they really recommend your book, which they never really crossed my mind. I always thought it just mattered, the merit of the work should stand up for itself. But really, in the world of publishing, who you are as a person is really important, which is cool. I mean, it's just really interesting. So that surprised me heaps. Did you find that, Sandy, when you first encountered the...
Yeah, I think the thing that surprised me the most was just how supportive the community is, other writers. You know, that sort of thing was really quite surprising. I've made some amazing friends, and, you know, people who write within the same genre as I do. You know, we should be on paper enemies, you know, because we're vying. We're vying for the same readers. But everybody is just so supportive and lovely. And the reason that I guess we're not rivals is because readers who read will read whatever you put out, and, you know, they'll not just buy one book, they'll buy 3 or 4 books. So they're buying me and my rivals as such.
It's good.
So,
it's good.
Yeah, I love the supportiveness of it. Now, just a warning for you, Kyle. Michelle has now added you to her list to be stalked. I've known Michelle for quite a few years, so I can vouch for the fact that she's a safe stalker as such.
Well, I'm safe in Tasmania. We've got a moat at the moment, so...
Well, that's right. We can't travel, so that's okay. One of the things that was really prominent in the Bluffs was the influence of social media. Yeah. So we've got 4 teenage girls who go missing in the Tasmanian wilderness, and social media is a very prominent thread through this. And as the mother of a teenage girl, this was quite frightening, how influential social media can be. And in the book, it wasn't just that it was influential amongst that group of peers, but once they went missing, you know, social media was dictating, controlling who the public, as in general, were seeing as innocent and guilty. It had that much power. And I wanted to ask you, the way that we live through social media, how has that changed crime writing, do you think?
That's a really good question. I think from like a practical point of view, social media makes it very hard to hide or to be uncontactable, and to create falsehoods. As in, like, if you want to just pretend you're someone you're not, it's very difficult to do. Hey, Matt. Matt was one of my students when I worked in high schools. Best friend Matt. Good to see you, man. I think that social media itself, I mean, Matt actually would be really a great person to talk about it, because when I started working in high schools, I didn't understand the havoc that social media causes nowadays. And in the novel, it's drawn out because it affects the whole community, which happens. Lynch mobs are still a thing, and social media makes that easier. But in the culture and the world of high school, social media is one of the most scary things that they have to encounter. And in the book, there's a message thread that has a group of teenage girls sharing their self-injurious behavior with each other.
Mm.
And that message thread was a real event that I had to deal with at one of my schools.
Right.
And so how that changes crime is there's suddenly all this darkness, and it's going on like underneath us. So I think it makes sense for social media to continue playing a big part in crime fiction, because at the end of the day, it's one of the scariest things happening.
Yeah, it really, as I said, as the mother of a teenage daughter, it frightens the bejesus out of me, what's happening out there. And I'm going to actually read a quote from the book, and it doesn't give any spoilers away, so it's okay. And it says, "Just a child. What a world we live in now, that a child with a camera can cause all of this carnage." And I think that's something that, perhaps as parents, we're not fully aware just how much damage social media can do to our children. And that's frightening. And for me, that was probably the most frightening part of the book, not the hungry man hiding in the hills or anything like that, but, because that's such a real thing that I can relate to, it really did frighten me. So.
And also because it is based on real things that are happening. Like, it's not out of the realm of possibility. That's what makes it scary.
Yeah, exactly. I can see it happening. You can. It's absolutely true. Bev would like to know how long it took you to write The Bluffs.
I wrote the first draft in 3 months. From the moment I came up with the idea to the moment I submitted it to my agent, was 3 months. That was the first draft. Yeah, no, like, I smashed it out. Hey, it was pretty good. I was pretty good. But then after getting some feedback about how to change it, it took me, I think it's been 3 years since the moment I started to today. Yep. So it took me 2 years to write it then. And part of that was more because I was working in such an intense environment. It was quite hard to get home and write some days. And also because the nature of the industry is it's quite slow when you're waiting for people to get back to you with feedback. So I couldn't give you like a proper figure of how many hours it took me, but it's been 3 years since I started. We'll put it down to that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Debbie's saying she's glad she's a reader because writing sounds really hard. There are worse things we could be doing. There are worse things we could be doing with our time than writing. There are definitely moments where it's hard, but at the end of the day, when you get to hold this baby in your hands and get to interact with readers, it's worth it in the end, isn't it?
It's worth it. I mean, and I think to be a writer, you've got to love it. If you don't love it, then you go home, because you're not gonna get anything out of it, I don't think.
No, that's exactly right. If you're not passionate about it, you won't last the distance. It's very important. Ali says she loves both of our books, even though they're such different genres. And I think this comes back to what we were saying about readers, and we're not rivals as writers, because readers will read across many genres. So yeah,
absolutely. I mean, I don't really have a favorite genre. Oh, stop. I read heaps of different types, and I think that's good. I think it's important, and that's to be a well-rounded human being, you should read widely, because all stories at their core, I mean, every story is a love story, really, and that, every story's got something to tell us about humanity.
Absolutely. And as writers, the more widely we read, the better writers we become as well.
Absolutely. 100%.
Cassie would like to know, what's the best piece of writing advice you've ever received?
Okay, so that's a hard question, but I'm going to tell you the best writing advice ever received was to sleep well, to look after my sleep, to eat well, and to exercise. Because, and that's the same advice I'd give to counselors, and I was given as a counselor, because my body is the instrument. And as a writer, your body's the instrument. You're not pulling it from, some special neuron in your brain. You're using your whole body, using your whole experience. And if you don't look after your sleep, if you don't look after what you eat, and if you don't get out and move, your body is never going to operate at its best capacity, and your writing is never going to be the best it can be. So, I mean, there's heaps of good writing books. I've got like a shelf full of them. But the best single piece of writing advice is just look after your body, and you'll see the benefits.
Yeah, that's really good advice, and something I should take heed of, I think. Yes. Jodie's got a follow-up question. We've probably covered most of it. Her internet's been cutting in and out. It's terrifying enough dealing with her own kids, right? So on top of social media. Yeah, that's true. She had a question here which I've just missed. Sorry, Jodie. What is your journey to publication? You've sort of touched on how long it took.
Yeah, it's a long story, but essentially, I've written, before I wrote the Bluffs, I'd written about 10 manuscripts. So I've been writing about a book a year since I was 16. Mm-hmm. And they were all in the young adult and fantasy genre. And I didn't get anywhere with them. I got really close a number of times, but never got anywhere. And that's when I reached out to Haley Nash, my agent, who at the time was also a freelance editor. And I said, hey, can you just read my book and I'll pay you to tell me what I'm doing wrong? And then she said, well, maybe you should try something different. And so I had the conversation with her, and then we both, she helped me see that I should try something different. And I started to realize that maybe I am good enough to write adult fiction. I always thought I didn't really have it in me. I was pretty stuck in a rut in terms of writing young adult. And then, so I followed her advice. I wrote the Bluffs in 3 months. Like I said, I submitted it to her for a manuscript appraisal that I paid her to read it. And then she got back to me and she was like, I'm floored by this. This is amazing. And then that began a slow dance around each other, in terms of the fact that she was interested in me as a client, like to take me up as an author, and but we just needed to get the book to the right level. And then eventually, it's 2 years later, 2 years from that first phone call, yep, she finally sent me that email and said, I want to sign you. And then within a fortnight, my publisher had flown down to meet me in Hobart, and the offer was made. So it was a long, long journey to get an agent, and then overnight, basically, I had a contract.
Yeah, it's a story that I can relate to. It was a long, 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 long journey. Mine was about 11 years to actually get in front of the right person at the right time. But then when I did, I've now had 3 books in 3 years. So yeah. It's a strange old journey, isn't it? We've got
it's kind of bittersweet, because you're like, man, I'm so glad to finally be here. And then you're like, why did it take so long? But I mean, you've got to live that, and I don't regret any of it, because I know it's made me. I'm not naturally a good writer. Like my prose is good now, but my early books, first 5, they're woeful. So I had to work really hard. So I mean, that's why it took me 10 years.
Yeah, and it's also, I think, a little bit of, you know, the universe speaking, I guess, in a way that these things happen when they're supposed to happen.
Absolutely.
You know, if I had got published 10 years ago, you know, when I first started, it was actually longer than 10 years ago now, you know, I wouldn't have the experience that I have now to be able to put into those books. So I think everything happens at the right time for the right reasons.
Things happen when they happen.
They do. Cheryl's got a lovely comment here, which goes back to what we were saying about the supportiveness of the writing community. And she's talking about the sisterhood, but it goes beyond the sisterhood, or unless you're an honorary member of the sisterhood today, Kyle, that it was through Monica McInerney, who's one of my literary heroes, that she found me. And through me, she found Tabitha Bird and Cassie Hamer and Danny's podcast. And I think that's the beautiful thing about the writing community and how we support each other, because it helps us all find our readers, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm conscious of the time. I know that Kyle has other events to go to today because he is the man of the hour. So I am going to ask you one more question from me, and then if there are any last questions from people watching, we'll pop those up as well. I wanted to talk about Murphy, if I can. Now, on paper, he is a character that somebody like me, as we've talked about, being a scaredy cat and not a risk taker, should run for the hills from. Murphy is this big, scary, drug-dealing father of one of the girls that goes missing. So in real life, that would be a character I would, as I said, run away from as quickly as possible. He's the character that I loved the most in the story. And that was a bit of a shock to me, that I felt so kindly towards Murphy. And I wanted to ask you, how do you find that balance? A character that on paper is not a likable person, is not a nice person, yet me as a reader, I fell in love with him. How did you do that?
I'm so glad you said that, because he was the first character I came up with, and the heart of the book is Murphy. Part of what I wanted to achieve in this book was to get across the fact that drug dealers aren't always terrible people. They're not always scary people. And I work with some of the toughest people you'll ever meet. So I can say that someone like you has the least to fear from a drug dealer, because I mean, you're not a client and you're not competition. Someone
definitely not competition.
I'm a little bit more at risk, but someone like you, they would do anything for you. If you want them to mow your lawns, they do it. And that's what people don't understand, is that crime is bad, but the drug world is so unique, and it has its own unique subcultures and rules and politics. And they're some of the best people. And I say that genuinely. To be a drug dealer, you have to be a good person, because you're dealing with broken people, and you need to know how to manage them, and you need to know how to do business. So at the heart of this story, at the start of this story, I wanted to get across the fact that, anyway, so sorry, I'll go back. Murphy's character himself was inspired by a conversation I had with a client where he said that everyone sees him, he's a drug dealer, and everyone sees him as a worthless human. And society looks down on him. No one gives him a chance. People run away from him in the street. And he said because of that, that's how he acts. Of course, he's not going to be warm to people. Of course, he's not going to open up, because no one actually cares. And so that broke my heart. And that's what made me so passionate about men's health, especially men's mental health. And at the core of this book, that was a message I wanted to get across, is that actually, you know, people in this situation, they're sometimes really good guys and they deserve a chance, and you'd be surprised at how much good is inside of them. So I'm glad that came across in the book. It wasn't necessarily a conscious literary choice. Like I said, everything in the book happens organically. I mean, editing comes in and it amplifies it. It makes facts more real. But at the start and the end of Murphy's journey, it's all about getting across that this is a real human being who is living down the street from you and just deserves a second chance.
Yeah, no, you did that so well. I wasn't expecting to, you know, of all the characters in the book, for me to feel for. I would never have thought it would have been Murphy. So so that was really good. And I'm not going to tell anyone whether it was a good or a bad ending for Murphy, because you're going to have to read the book to find out. I'm going to wrap it up here now because, as I said, I am conscious of your time, Kyle. I'm going to pop up Kyle's social media details so that you know where to find him if you're looking for him. If there's any last minute questions, we'll pop them up now. Otherwise, it's just lots of beautiful comments like Karen, who has read it and she kept guessing right to the end. And Karen is one of these readers that I know reads across many, many genres that we were talking about before.
Awesome.
So, and I'm just seeing if there's any other questions coming through. I don't think so. Cheryl is commenting on your 3 months and the hours and the waiting and the patience, and she's glad that you stayed and waited. Yes, I'm glad that you did too.
Me too, yeah.
And that's part of it, isn't it? It's those of us that manage to get published are the ones that stick with it a lot of the time.
Yeah.
You know, face those rejections and keep going and pick yourself up and dust yourself off and keep going to the end. Thank you so much for joining me today, Kyle. It's been lovely chatting with you and seeing Margot pop across the screen a couple of times. Have fun tonight. I know you've got an in-person event tonight that you're going to. You still can down there in Tasmania. We can't do them here in Sydney yet. So, have a wonderful rest of the day and have a great weekend. Thank you everyone for joining us, and don't forget, if you are watching this back later, you can still be in the running to win a copy of Kyle's gorgeous book, The Bluffs, if you make a comment. So thank you so much, Kyle, and we will see everybody next week for another session of Friday Book Bites. Thank you.
Thanks so much.